So, as the urban legend goes, in the late 19th century, Daniel Robitaille, the son of a slave who rose to prominence because he was a talented artist, was hired to paint a portrait of a well-to-do white woman. Unfortunately for them, the pair fell in love and had a baby. The woman's father, discovering this apparent travesty, led a lynch mob after the young man, and having caught up with him, they cut off his painting hand, smothered him with honey, and left him to be stung to death by a swarm of bees. Still not content with this, they then burned his body and scattered his ashes across an area that would eventually be known as the Cabrini-Green housing project in Chicago, and Daniel Robitaille would eventually come to be known as. So 1992's Candyman is interestingly placed in the horror timeline, coming off a slew of 80s slashers and censor-baiting video nasties, but still a few years before Wes Craven changed the game again with the genre-busting Scream. So that being said, it's almost unusual these days for there to be a horror film with no teenage main characters, and the whole thing definitely has that chilly Clive Barker vibe running through it, having been based off one of his novellas, The Forbidden. And for the movie version, the action moves from the UK to Chicago, primarily in the aforementioned Cabrini-Green housing projects, which is scary enough on their own. The film was mostly shot on location. It's probably the grittiest, grottiest looking horror movie since 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Guys, I'm Steve at Real Classic Film Reviews. Click that subscribe button and the notification bell to stay up to date with some of the awesome classic film reviews I've got coming up. And do all that other YouTubey stuff, like, comment, etc. Now let's get back to the video. So Candyman features our main character, Helen Lyle, played here by Virginia Madsen, a graduate student researching urban legends for her thesis. She's researching these legends when she comes across the story of Candyman. Sensing a scoop for her thesis, she interviews a university janitor who claims that the Candyman murdered someone in her neighbourhood. Now, as the legend goes, if you say Candyman's name 5 times in front of a mirror, he allegedly appears and murders you. Not taking this as seriously as they should, Helen and her friend Bernadette have a few drinks and say his name in the mirror 5 times, and nothing happens at first. Now, as the pair begin to visit the infamous Cabrini-Green estate to investigate the janitor's Candyman story, this is where Helen comes face to face with an imposter and his gang in one of cinema's worst public toilets. And it's a scene that's a kind of turning point for the movie as the film starts to shift from creepy urban legends investigation film and begins its descent into a hypnotic, supernatural mind-bender.
Helen, I came for you.
So eventually the real Candyman, played here by an imposing Tony Todd, arrives on the scene and instantly creates one of horror's most iconic villains. This killer doesn't have a mask or some kind of horrendous disfigurement, but he does have a hook in the gory stump where his hand should be. And he's pretty upset by Helen's research as she's kind of helping convince others that he does not exist and therefore is jeopardising his legend. Now here's where one of the film's strange themes comes in, because Candyman doesn't seem to want to instantly hook Helen to death, but he almost seductively urges her to become one of his victims, which she awkwardly resists, so he sets out to prove himself to her. And that plot shift I spoke about a moment ago does kick into high gear here when, after a blackout, Helen comes to in a Cabrini-Green apartment, covered in blood next to a headless dog and about to be blamed for a missing baby. And as the film kicks in, that pesky Candyman begins to appear more and more frequently, but obviously only to Helen, and starts killing people left, right and centre. And Helen keeps getting blamed for all the slaughter, ending up in all sorts of trouble with the police, the psychiatric ward, and her slimy, unfaithful husband, played by Xander Berkley. So Candyman is kind of a horror movie. It has a great titular villain and nasty hook deaths, etc., but it's not really an out-and-out slasher horror, so stay with me on this one. It doesn't rely on shoehorning in jump scares every 10 minutes, and instead uses its gritty Chicago setting and its creepy but excellent Philip Glass music to give it a great atmosphere. It's probably one of the least glamorous horror films I've ever seen. The entire film looks damp and grey, and its run-down, graffiti-covered Cabrini-Green estate is scarier than most haunted houses. I'm a fan of Candyman's plan/desire to seduce Helen into becoming his victim. I suppose he could have hook-sliced her at any time, but he really wants to make her part of his urban legend, which is an odd but quite unique motivation. And with the help of Tony Todd's deep but silky smooth voice, Candyman describes a slow, painful death in ways that make it sound almost appealing.
But I'm afraid.
Do you fear the pain? Or what is beyond?
Both.
The pain, I can assure you, will be exquisite. As for our deaths, there is nothing to fear.
Tony Todd has that big, foreboding presence and a menacing voice. And I like the idea that most of his dialogue is voiceover, even when he's on screen. It gives the scenes more of a dreamlike vibe. There's also a few creepy kind of how did they do that scenes where he starts regurgitating bees. That's probably not for those who don't like their creepy crawlies. Now, it's a shame Virginia Madsen mostly disappeared back into bouncing between TV work and so-so movies, because she's a great actress who truly gets put through the ringer in this film, getting covered in blood, bees and fire. It's great seeing her go from a bit naive and a little bit weak at the beginning to much stronger as the film and her troubles develop. I'm not quite sure how a douchebag of a husband manages to keep her sweet and romance one of his students at the same time. In a film full of supernatural terror, it's probably the most unbelievable part. So despite having budgetary limitations, English filmmaker Bernard Rose managed to adapt and direct a pretty polished and effective horror movie with Candyman, aided by some brilliantly bleak photography from Anthony B. Richmond. I'm a big fan of all the aerial shots scattered throughout the film that give it a sense of scale that its budget couldn't. Now, there's an interesting kind of alternate version of this film that I like to imagine, and maybe one that the film hints at a little bit, and that's whether or not the mythological Candyman really does appear to terrorise Helen, or whether she becomes so deeply immersed and infatuated with her own study of the legend that she herself acts out all of this terrible vengeance. So with everything held together by Clive Barker's awesome central premise, Candyman has earned its place as one of the horror films of the 90s, with a villain that is one of the horror icons in cinema. Go check it out. Just don't be tempted the next time you look into that mirror.